Well. Welcome to episode 2 of the Thoughts and Adventure podcast. I am your host, Charles Johnson. Looking forward to kind of going through bit by bit what's in the news, what are the topics. I'm here with my trusty Mr. Producer, and I think we just purchased some equipment to upgrade our podcast. So thank you to those who sent in some cash to help us do that. I will be going through the news, the topics du jour, and if there are people who um, and if there are people here who want to come up on stage and chat, we're happy to have you. Though, generally speaking, you should hit up Mr. Producer with whatever questions you might have. He's kind of paying much more attention to that than I am. So we have kind of a jam-packed show for you today. I'm going to go through. We're of course going to be streaming this on various platforms and downloading it and putting it up on the Chuck Stack podcast. There's certainly a lot of news to talk about, and there's certainly a lot of things in particular that are quite interesting. The first thing I wanted to do is direct your attention to a Revolver News piece that I think is kind of interesting. It's about yours truly, and it's about a lot of the legal woes that I've supposedly been having. I don't really regard them as woes. I regard them as kind of useful for cleaning up some of the fraudulent stuff around me. But the piece was up by Joe Brucker. I think that's how you say his name. And Mr. Producer will put this up in the Jumbotron. But let me just read part of it for you because I want you to get kind of a flavor for kind of what we're up to over here. Chuck Johnson is a figure who's elicited quite a bit of intrigue. Media Matters has just over a full page of pieces on him, and when House Democrats investigated connections to election interference from Russia, he was on their interviewee list. Even his ban from Twitter, invitation to the State of the Union, and old texts with the vice president alone have been enough to generate news for several days. Johnson's trolling casts a cloud over whether his words or actions are serious, and that murkiness itself has had consequences. At the center of a recent RICO case, an investor accused him of bullying startups into forking over ownership, claiming to be on a two-man team of intelligence assets or assets of U.S. government agencies who could sabotage companies' contracts or funding. That RICO case resulted in a judgment of over $70 million. Johnson's appealing, but he seems to be taking it in good spirits. He told me, quote, he's disappointed he only took the bronze for the third largest judgment of its kind. I attended recent related court proceedings where he's suing a company in which the same investor who sued him is part owner, Clearview AI. It goes on. I think I lost Mr. Producer. Are you coming back, Mr. Producer? He says he's coming back. But I wanted to kind of show these kind of articles, these kind of discussions are pretty interesting to me. They're sort of fascinating in their right. There was, of course, Matt Forney was there. There were sort of a number of players who were there who were clearly paid to be there to kind of, mock me, ridicule me, what have you. Later this week, I'm going to be filing my appeal at the Fifth Circuit over the $70 million judgment. I suspect I will have the entire thing overturned or some portion of it in much the same way that President Trump had the huge judgment against him overturned by the courts. And so I'm kind of looking forward to the process and having it kind of play out. I wanted to say, though, just for the kind of purposes of this space, that not only am I not really worried about it, I'm kind of excited by the opportunity. And that might strike you as a kind of strange thing to say, but it's nevertheless something which I'm actually feeling. My sense of it is that it's going to be very exciting over the next few years to kind of see who on in the MAGA agenda, who on the MAGA side of things, um, is going to be revealed to be a kind of working for other governments, working for other countries. And I think people will be kind of shocked at that as time goes on. Although maybe not so much now that we're seeing a lot more about what's going on in the Middle East. Um, I've been following the the Middle East issues now for quite some time. I recently was on a television, an ABC News affiliate, discussing the potential peace deal here, and I have to say I found the whole thing pretty fascinating. Now I don't really subscribe to the kind of conventional views of what happens. I don't believe that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff or any of those kind of players were actually responsible for the progress in the Middle East. I think, on the contrary, what really happened was the previous month in September, Netanyahu's kind of criminal government tried to murder a bunch of Hamas supporters in Qatar, and then mercifully, they sort of escaped being killed. Now, Qatar is an extremely important ally to the United States. I have written about them before, about how they really our greatest ally in the Middle East, them and Turkey. And I've not, unlike other people who might claim it, I've not been paid any money by either country. And generally speaking, I like the Qataris and the Turks, some of them at least. And I will say that we're watching a kind of reestablishment of a new kind of a power source within the Middle East, and that of course led by Turkey and by to a lesser extent Qatar, which is really a kind of proxy of U.S. and British interests in the region. My read of the situation is that, in effect, and I put this up in the chat, but in effect, what we saw the Qataris wanting to get a security guarantee from the United States, a country that it doesn't have the closest of ties with. That's sort of changing lately, but historically, Qatar has been much more closely aligned with France and the United Kingdom. I believe at one point, the sort of emir of Qatar, they sort of, they're educated in the British system. That we're a sort of massive country to them. I think there's something like only 200,000 Qataris, which is why all these kind of like Israeli arguments about how Qatar is like funding the Muslim Brotherhood and they're doing all this terrible stuff. Why all of that is kind of ridiculous. The truth of the matter is that Qatar is an extremely wealthy country, one of the wealthiest per capita on the planet. And after Russia and Iran, their gas sources are critically important to the safety and protection of European industry. And they were determined to be a non-NATO ally in 2020, or excuse me, 22 by Biden, and they've been extremely helpful with the U.S. Over the years. And so I'm a fan of theirs. I know the Qatari ambassador here in D.C. No is kind of a big word, but I've met him a number of times, and he's been very friendly. And I have a number of friends who work in the Qatari embassy here in D.C. And it's a kind of place that I have a lot of respect for as a kind of honest broker in the region. It's also a place, though, given its immense wealth, that has sent money around, and it uses its money to kind of buy peace, to kind of bribe people in a kind of peaceful setting. And I think that that's what's going on here. You'll note that the two kind of Jewish Americans who are seen as being at the center of the Qatar matter are Jared Kushner and, of course, Steve Witkoff. Both of whom have investors from Qatar, I believe from their sovereign wealth fund. And my understanding of what happened is that when Netanyahu tried to attack Qatar, which has U.S. military installations there and a CIA listening post there, that in effect triggered the series of events that led to the peace setup. And I think I've seen some reporting, Politico and elsewhere, saying much the same thing. Now, my interpretation of things is that for a very long time, Netanyahu was using the Qataris and using some of the other players in the region to fund the more extremist elements. You certainly saw this with Hamas, where he okayed a lot of money going from Qatar down to Hamas because he didn't really want to deal with a more moderate Palestinian Authority. And Netanyahu's objective over the last bit has been to, in effect, wipe out Palestinian statehood. And that is, of course, what his political constituencies want. And indeed, we should sort of take them seriously. It's not what Israel wants. And of course, one of the funnier things lately has been seeing all these American right wingers who are on Bibi's payroll or on the payroll of people who are connected to Bibi, making certain arguments, and we're sort of seeing all that play out now. We're seeing the Ben Shapiro's of the world exposed as kind of fifth columnists within the United States. So I think all this is to the good, and I congratulate President Trump on what appears to be a victory with respect to maybe setting up a Palestinian state, maybe getting the Arab nations to fund it and finance it. Um, and I think from our perspective, it kind of isolates Netanyahu. It sort of creates the impression that we're going to have an Abraham Accords, maybe without Netanyahu present at all. And I think that this is all a pretty good development, the kind of uniting of the Arab world around helping the Palestinians, which of course are one of the Arab tribes. Um, I wanted to just say I do think it's really interesting, though, like how much there's a kind of deference paid to Kushner, a deference paid to Steve Witkoff. For a very long time, Kushner has been, in effect, arguing that the Palestinians should be ignored, that the Palestinians we should just move past the Palestinians, that they don't really matter to the future of the Middle East. And of course, we've seen over and over and over again that the other Arab leaders, particularly Saudi Arabia, and to some extent, Egypt very much wants this problem solved. And I elsewhere mentioned uh, the issue around Revolver News. Revolver was founded by Darren Beattie, who's now at the State Department, and Darren was married to a Russian woman. He's a very pro-Likud guy, and he, along with the other Likudnik types, have tried to get all of the Palestinians to move into Egypt. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a kind of rebuffing of that attempt. And it'll be interesting to see like which pro Netanyahu, which pro Bibi players continue to have jobs going forward. I think that's going to be something we're going to want to pay attention to as time goes on. Um, you know, so I have a whole list of things. Mr. Producer, would you mind taking the topics for show suggestions and putting that up in the jumbotron? That would be kind of helpful because I think people can kind of get a sense of where we're going and maybe even plan some questions around it. The one that starts with Ghislaine, Epstein email dumps. I think one of the things here that we're starting to see is the degree to which people like Laura Loomer, who's historically been a friend of mine, the degree to which the Ben Shapiro's of the world, who's never been a friend of mine, the degree to which a lot of these guys are on the payroll of foreign governments, and in particular, they're on the payroll of the kind of IDF world, and I think we're sort of watching that play out. No less a source than Yossi Cohen, the former director of Mossad, was on with Barry Weiss, I think before the CBS deal went through, and what he was saying is that Netanyahu more or less has to go. So the Mossad world as well is sort of taking the position that Gaza is in effect an independent place. It's not the kind of place that law enforcement, the sort of Shin Bet or FBI equivalent of Israel, is equipped to deal with. And I think that's sort of useful to pay attention to. Things are sort of shifting in Israel and kind of leaving behind a number of the pro-Netanyahu assets here. People are pointing out that that Trump, said, that they should pardon Bibi, but I think that was as much reminding everyone that Netanyahu is a criminal, and that he was in effect showing the Knesset that he knows what's up. He knows the score with Bibi, and I'm certain he has other intelligence that kind of points him in that direction as well. Um, you know, I think it's been rather remarkable watching the kind of freak out that Steve Bannon and others have had around this Qatari air base allegedly being built in Idaho. I was joking the other day that no Qatari has ever called me a white supremacist. No Qatari has ever tried to kick me out of my bank. No Qatari has, as far as I know, even any notion that they don't really pay attention to American politics. They've never called me a Holocaust denier, nor have they tried to force me to watch a film about their country, like in the form of Schindler's List. So I'm not a huge critic of the Qataris, and I think we have a lot of military bases and installations in the United States that belong to other allies of ours. There are other consulates. There are other military installations. I live, near one that is the German military base that operates here near me in Northern Virginia. So it's really not a crazy idea. It's actually a pretty normal idea to have an ally of ours learn how to fly planes, learn how to build an air force. And of course, we would much prefer they do it here than in other countries, right? It's sort of a way of keeping tabs on them, paying attention to what's going on there. And I think as we see the United States on the whole move away from oil as the kind of like sine qua non of world politics, as a sort of essential resource, we'll move much more into gas and to electrification. And of course, I think Qatar's power and eminence in the world will only grow accordingly. I think this is ultimately, by the way, why the U.S. is going to move to have a more peaceful series of interactions with Iran. And I think what's going to have to happen in the United States is we're going to have to call out and clean up a lot of the Netanyahu Israeli influencers in our society. Um, Mr. Producer, okay, yeah, I mean, on that point, Aptera, which is a solar-powered car company, which is something that I invested in a little while ago now. Aptera is going to be publicly listed, which is an interesting play because it's a kind of company that is a solar-powered car, and it's moving in the right direction towards having electric cars, but not ones that necessarily rely on the grid. And I, frankly, I drove the car. I went out there with some family members of mine. Um, I have no idea when it's going to start shipping. There's sort of conflicting accounts on that, and there's lots of information by the Tesla guys who really hate this car. They really don't want to see Aptera take off, and I can understand why they don't want to see that happen. I mean, Aptera is a superior car in a lot of ways. It's cheaper. It's more energy efficient. It's easier to fix in a lot of ways, and of course, it's not really manufactured in China, which of course is where things are sort of one of the problems we're having in these tariff negotiations with China is how much they control things like world battery supply, which is of course essential if you're building an electric car. It's ultimately why I said a long time ago that Elon's days were in effect numbered politically, that he wasn't going to really recover because Tesla is very much a Chinese company. And I shared that up in the Jumbotron. Those of you who are interested, this is not investment advice. This is an entertainment show, but it's certainly something that I've invested in and something that I back and will continue to back as time goes on. Simply to be in the car and driving it around, and it had a huge effect on me. And this idea that we could live in a world in which the average commuter that drives less than 40 miles a day could have their energy needs met by just having their car outside getting charged. That I think is a very revolutionary idea. And as Aptera kind of takes off, I think it'll be interesting to watch what happens with solar mobility generally. Are we going to live in a world in which solar panels, efficiently made, are going to be on all kinds of vehicles, all kinds of buildings going forward? And of course, I think this is a very good development, all things considered. Um, People want me to weigh in on Peter's Antichrist lecture series. I'm kind of of mixed minds about when I engage on the Palantir question or on the Peter Thiel question. I think Peter's a fraud, and I've said as much elsewhere. And so even to really pretend that he had anything interesting and insightful to say is to kind of give him more attention than he's due. And I think that to some extent, one of the problems with these Silicon Valley guys generally is that they're just kind of like full of shit. They don't really have anything to really offer the country as a whole. And so, I did read a lot of the articles about his whole theory of the Antichrist. What I think it really comes down to is that he doesn't really want any of these AI companies to be regulated. And I suspect the AI companies, are in effect a giant bubble that sits over our entire stock market. And I suspect this bubble will burst in the near term and take with it a lot of the savings of a lot of Americans and a lot of other people. And so I think ultimately the scapegoat, if you will, going into the 2028 election is going to be these tech guys. And I think it's kind of unclear if it will be Peter Thiel or if it will be Elon Musk that really gets the brunt of that. You could see that there's criminal investigations going on already as concerns Tesla self-driving cars, which don't work, which are a fraud. And so I'm very kind of curious to see how that plays out. I am not of the view that American hegemony is a bad thing. I think the world would be much better off if everybody used the U.S. dollar. I think the world would be a much better place if the NSA penetrated everywhere. And in general, my view of this kind of one world government thing, I don't think it's all that bad. I think it's actually quite useful. And I think to some extent, Greta, who Peter Thiel and others have called an antichrist, um, Greta is a kind of, I've got nothing against her. I think she was quite brave to go and do the Gaza flotilla raids, into Gaza. I think, by the way, that too is the untold part of the peace deal that took place, because these 500 people more or less overwhelmed the Gaza the sort of naval blockade that was going on in Israel, and sort of showed how weak it was. And so, in general, I'm pro Greta, and I think that Greta is by no means the Antichrist. Greta is actually a sign of kind of youth leadership, and that we should be encouraging that as time goes on. I also don't really agree with Thiel's interpretation of the Antichrist. I think Thiel's very self-serving in how he talks about things. And I do think it'll be interesting to see what ultimately happens with Anduril and Palantir. I mean, there was that Army assessment. Maybe, Mr. Producer, you can put that up in the Jumbotron. But the Army assessment that showed that Palantir and Anduril were not reliable technologies. And I think that that's a sign of a kiss of death coming for this kind of defense tech space. And maybe as the United States gets more, gets on a roll here, maybe we can negotiate a peace settlement with Ukraine as well. And I think this too will have downward pressure on all these so-called defense stock companies. At least that's sort of what I'm hoping and calculating. Um, I'm not a big believer when people go to the Wailing Wall, when people kind of go to Israel generally. I've been to Israel myself. I stayed in Tel Aviv. I went to Jaffa. Um, but I'm not a big believer in going to the kind of Disneyland, Middle East kind of thing. I think it's kind of weird and creepy when people go and put on yarmulkes. I went to a friend's wedding recently who was Jewish, and I didn't wear a yarmulke. It's just not my thing. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it is how you should be engaging unless you're a member of that faith. And so when I see Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff run, to the Middle East, and they're sort of trying, I think, to protect their own investments more than they're trying to protect our country. I think that that's a bit much. And so my interpretation, for what it's worth, is that Jared will continue to be a pro, basically a pro. What would I say? I would describe Jared as a pro Netanyahu spy within the inner circle of the Trump world, and certainly we saw that with his teacher, the teacher that he had for his kids, who was also Chinese. We see this with the Wendy Dang relationships, and it's worth paying attention to that. This is from the New York Times. So, as Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy to the Middle East, conducted delicate ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas this year, his son Alex was on another mission. He was quietly soliciting billions of dollars from some of the same governments whose representatives were involved in peace talks with his father. Alex Witkoff pitched Qatar, a mediator in the Gaza talks and a key U.S. ally, on planned investment fund focused on commercial real estate projects in the United States, according to a spokesman for Qatar's sovereign wealth funds. My read on what's really going on here is that the Qataris are, in effect, playing these guys, and that the Qataris, sensing that they had an opportunity to get a security guarantee from the United States, in effect said, "You're going to protect us going forward, or we're just not going to invest in the United States, and we're not going to invest behind you." And I think that that was enough to force, Kushner and to force some of the other players to the table. And Kushner's family was bailed out by 666 Fifth Avenue, which is, his family property. I think, I can't remember if it was a few years back, but his outfit, he's gotten, billions of dollars over the years from Qatar. And so my interpretation of it, for what it's worth, is that whenever people talk about an anti-Qatar kind of thing, what they're doing is they're in effect shaking down Qatar. And I've written about this at my Substack, Mr. Producer. If you put that up, the one about how Qatar is the greatest ally in the Middle East, I think I did this I think it might be up in the jumbotron already, but I think it will be it's certainly worthwhile to have a look see at it, because I think this is the piece I wrote. So I wrote this piece back in 2022, January 2022, defending our real greatest ally, the scapegoating and shakedown of Qatar. And in effect, my argument was that that Donald Trump and a number of other players were shaking down Qatar, and that the purpose of shaking them down was to get them to cough up cash. And that's in effect what's really going on there. And you can see that with things like this blood money. There was this weird thing a while back that Mike Cernovich did, and the purpose was to extort Qatar and to sort of pretend to be peacemakers there. There was this effort to blockade Qatar at one point, and so there's this sort of history here of basically shaking down Qatar. And I think what we're seeing now is that Qatar is getting much more sophisticated at understanding our political arrangements and sort of ways in which we can kind of deal with things in the U.S. And I think that's all to the good. And I think that Qatar is that unsinkable aircraft carrier that everybody talks about with respect to Israel. I watched a little bit of Trump's visit to the Knesset. I saw some of the clips. I personally wasn't all that impressed by the situation. I'm kind of more impressed by what Trump ended up doing in Egypt, where he got the escort and he had all the different Arab players there. And of course, Trump was out there praising Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, which I think is a very good development. I would like to see the U.S. and Turkey generally become much stronger allies. We're obviously the two largest armies in NATO. And of course, my view is that we need the Turks on all kinds of strategic in that region, but around the world, particularly as their drone technology continues to be some of the superior technology out of the region, and indeed, I think, out of the world. Let's see. I have a few other notes here. Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of obsession with hostages generally is why Israel gets into all these problems. I don't really believe that we should be moving heaven and earth around all this. In effect, you can spend too many resources trying to get back one person or 20 people, and this kind of obsession over that is a bit much. There's such a thing as a cost-benefit analysis, and there's clearly a calculation where a certain number of Palestinian lives are worth one Israeli life. Even in Israel, even if they don't want to admit that all human life is equal and sacred, which of course is something that a lot of the sort of far right Jewish supremacist parts of Netanyahu's coalition would never admit. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, so people are asking me a lot about what I think about. We're gonna put this up there, right? The Guardian article, the Washington Post one, and all that. You're putting all that up, Mr. Producer. Okay, cool. Put all of that up in the jumbotron, or maybe do a post with it, and then we'll put it up. I think that so there's a lot of this obsession about uh, Zoran Mamdani, uh, and Zoran Mamdani. Basically, what I would say about Zoran Mamdani is I think he's obviously going to win. I support him winning. I think it'll be very good for the country on the whole if he wins. I think it will, in effect, lead to a sea change within the Democratic Party. I think it's all to the good. And the fact that he's got $13,000 behind him of foreign money, it's become this like huge sensational thing in the Post. I'm not convinced that it's that big a deal. $13,000 is not that much money in the grand scheme of things. Certainly not in for the future of of our most populous city. So I'm sort of like, I'm shrugging about it. Unless you're willing to talk about all of the settler cash, all of the money that goes back and forth between Israel and the sort of occupied territories, which of course does things like affect which properties get built, which slumlords are allowed to thrive in New York. I think all of that is kind of useful details and certainly worth paying attention to. Let's see here. Yeah, let me go. I'm going through this a bit. I think the big thing that I would say. Yeah, I've gotten some stuff about Leonard Leo, and all the efforts that Leonard Leo's taking up in Maine to try to protect Susan Collins. Leonard Leo, he was sort of seen as this big, Federalist Society kind of thing. I think Leonard Leo was, very closely backed by Barry Seid. Barry Seid is a Jewish, guy. I met him many years ago. Very tied in with the Israeli world, very tied in, sort of an asset of Netanyahu, and his company, which wasn't even his company. I think he took it over from somebody else. His company manufactured a lot of surge protectors and things in China. So I always regarded that money as somewhat suspect. And Leonard Leo is a very Opus Dei affiliated guy. Has all kinds of problems there. And I think you can kind of see Leonard Leo's attempt to clean things up. Um, you could kind of see it in the context of this being a very what could I say about it? A very Chinese attempt to take over the Republican Party. And so I like a lot of the ProPublica research that's been done on Barry's side. Maybe we can put that up too, Mr. Producer. That'd be useful to put that up, the Barry side ProPublica articles. And I think that there should be a counterintelligence investigation about a lot of those judges that came in. Um, but we shall see what ends up happening there. All things considered, I think that this effort to kind of control or mob up the judiciary is a very dangerous thing, whether it's done by the Republicans or by the Democrats. I think it's not good for our republic. And let me see here if I have a few other things that we're going through. Um, yeah, so people are asking me a lot about what I think about Nick Fuentes being allowed up on Spotify. Well, I think it's interesting that the timing of it is very interesting to me because so Daniel Ek, who's the Swedish founder of Spotify, is stepping down. It was sort of announced like 2 weeks or so ago, and suddenly Spotify is allowing Nick Fuentes up. And I think Neil Young had like quit Spotify, went to Apple, was leaving Apple, coming back to Spotify. So clearly there's like some kind of cleanup happening at Spotify. And I think this is a very good development and one we should be encouraging. In general, Nick, it's no secret that Nick and I are friends. I wish him well on what's going on. There's obviously going to be all these efforts to control, Mr. Fuentes, young Mr. Fuentes. And I think those should be resisted in whatever way we can encourage Nick to resist them. Because there's this effort to co-opt him and use him for their own agendas. And I just think that that's a really bad idea to have Nick get messed about with by all these different people. And I wouldn't go on as many shows as he's been going on, but I can appreciate that, he's going after it and he's trying to build his legend. But I honestly think that the show that he does is enough, and if people like it, they should like it. I think he's maybe getting a little too overexposed. And it's mostly out of safety concerns. I think he's obviously much safer when he's in control of his own environment. I hope he writes a book. I hope he continues to do what he's doing, and I wish him a lot of luck on how he's approaching things. He's certainly taught me a lot over the years, and I consider him not just a friend, but a good friend, as I have been quoted as saying. And I wish him well in his approach. Um, I do think we're going to see a lot more of uh, this kind of understanding that canceling people doesn't really work. It's just sort of not a good strategy. And I think we're also starting to realize the degree to which a lot of the Zionists took over a lot of the compliance software at banks and at other institutions. And I think we need to be really mindful that the kind of Israelis have used a lot of this technology over the years to limit certain voices, to restrict certain leadership, and I think we need to be on guard against that, particularly as this war winds down, that sort of thing doesn't come back into fashion. I think we're going to see, as time goes on, we're going to see much more pushback against Israeli activity in the United States. And certainly we should continue to insist that our weapons, our dollars, our resources that go over to Israel, to the Middle East generally, are not used to kill men, women, and children. It's kind of grotesque that I should even have to say that. Let's see here. There's a question about my novels. So yeah, I'm writing two novels now. One is a kind of roman à clef about various people in the conservative movement, and sort of growing up in the conservative movement, and how it sort of like takes advantage of you and rots your mind, and how much of it is foreign compromised. And that's sort of my first novel. My second novel is kind of more science fiction oriented. I've been sort of working on that, science fiction Mormon oriented. So I'll sort of have more to say on the second one at some point. And thank you to those of you there. I see a number of people in here who have been beta readers of my first novel, and I'm very grateful to you. I've, there's a lot of like little details and little questions that readers catch that I don't necessarily catch, and super helpful, super grateful for that. I think in general, I'm going to be doing more of these spaces in the future. People are interested; they can become subscribers, either paid or not, at the Substack. Uh, Over time, I've sort of said that the more capital we get from the public, the more like super chats, the more whatever, I'm just going to put into the show itself. So, Mr. Producer here, I'd like to hire him full time. Um, he's going to be like kind of like, I don't know, my Jamie equivalent in the Joe Rogan sense of it. And we're gonna just sort of belt out some of these things. I do think there should be guests at some point soon, so if people have ideas about who guests should be, I'm sort of curious about that. I went somewhere today and met with some people who were maybe interested in giving me studio space, and so I'm going to be sort of thinking through how that would work at some point in the near future. And I'm not quite sure if that space that I looked at today will work, but it's certainly something I'm sort of thinking through what that might look like. It's nearby my home here. It was a sort of interesting setup. So we shall see. If anyone wants to come up and ask questions or talk generally, yeah, I see there's a super chat thing up here. People are curious about asking me. I know we're also going to put this on YouTube, and I think we also put it up on our Substack as well. So anyone want to come up and ask a question or weigh in? Here we go. Welcome, Anglo.
Good afternoon. I was curious on your thoughts on the defense agreement between the U.S., Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, and I see this general push towards Israel instigating some kind of confrontation between Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey, and I see it as a way of them trying to break up NATO. But at the same time, this also primarily benefits both Russia and Israel. So, uh, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my general view is that so Cyprus is to a large extent an Israeli colony. If you go there, you'll see lots of Israelis running around. It's where a lot of their companies are based. I think Gal Luft, who was like one of the guys who was involved in being an Israeli spy who got arrested, he was arrested in Cyprus. He fled from Cyprus. So Cyprus.
They're actually calling like parts of Cyprus now the Israeli commuter area because so many of them that work in Tel Aviv live in Cyprus.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting to watch it shake And yeah, I think we're going to see more and more evidence as time goes on that a lot of really bad activity takes place. Um, that a lot of really bad activity takes place in Cyprus, targeting Americans, targeting Europeans. Cyprus is, of course, a member of the European Union. And so, of course, this is a way in which the Israelis can interact with the European Union by basing a lot of their operations out of Cyprus. Um, my just general view is that there's a strategy among a certain group of Israelis, most of them Likud, that are they're a kind of extension of the Russian sphere. And so, what they want to do in general is cause chaos in the region, and causing chaos in the region is ultimately drives up the price of resources like natural gas, like oil, and in a world in which if Israel got along with all of its neighbors, the United States wouldn't have to give it billions of dollars a year, right? So there's a certain sense in which there's a kind of moral hazard here. My view generally is that Israel is the problem in the Middle East, and that certainly the Zionist strategy of kind of ethnic cleansing, what Ben Shapiro has called transferring populations, which is ethnic cleansing by another means, that is very much a real problem and a growing concern within Israel and within the region. So my view, for what it's worth, is I'm happy to see that basically Turkey is running around cutting peace deals with everybody, which I think is a good thing. Watching them kind of swallowing up Syria, watching them engage in a more peaceful way with Greece. I think all that is a very encouraging thing. But yeah, my view in general is that Israel is the problem in the region, and until Netanyahu is brought to justice, which whether it happens in Israel or happens in the United States doesn't really bother me. But we're going to continue to see kind of extremist behavior out of that environment. And I think Trump has finally turned on Netanyahu in different ways. Um, and I think that's ultimately a good thing. But I do think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. In short, my view is that the problem in the Middle East is Netanyahu and the Likud party generally. And I think that is something we need to sort of think seriously about. Anyone else want to come up and ask a question, or?
I also just want to say, just to add to that, that David Wormser was making, and the I forget his name. He's the head of the Republicans overseas. They were both making reposts about how ethnic cleansing isn't a defined crime according to the UN. So that was very interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean they're very serious about actually like wiping out lots of people, and I think that's something to really think through. Go ahead, Tiger Lily. Welcome.
Hi, Charles. We've never spoken on a space, but I've briefly DM'd you. I'm actually circling back with you real briefly regarding something you mentioned last Wednesday. I was actually at Cedar Sinai. I couldn't speak to you, but you were talking about the Palisades.
Did we lose her? Say again, Tiger Lily. Something about the Palisades. I don't know. Can we hear her? Why don't you drop down and come back up? Angelo, can you hear her?
I can't hear her.
Okay, yeah, drop down and come back up, Tiger. I think when we get our real setup going, we'll have much fewer technical difficulties, so that'll be encouraging. Um, let's see here. Maybe I would want to say a few quick words about this individual who's in police custody in the Pacific Palisades situation with the fires there, because I do think it's worthwhile to talk about. I've been thinking about it a bit. This fire is quite incredible. I mean, it's something like $150 billion worth of damage. Uh, 12 people dead. This, of course, isn't the other fire that took place. Oh, I see we've got Tiger Lily back. Yeah, go ahead, Tiger Lily.
I thank you, Charles. Apologize for that. Was having network conditions there. Yeah. So the point I was actually offering was I am in touch with a number of people that did lose their homes. They've had an incredible challenge with regard to builders, I guess, engineers, people that actually have the means to actually reconstruct, but they're being met by all kinds of obstacles. And so I was curious on your take. And at the time you were speaking last week, I so badly wanted to touch base with you on that in light of kind of what you know. So
What
anyway, if I can offer anything, I'm
what
happy to
what
do
are the
so.
issues that they're facing?
Despite having architects and people willing to build, they seem to be facing either new zoning issues that are presenting themselves, or one of the gals that I spoke to over lunch, she's even been dealing with some of the leadership, the mayor. She was complaining at the time about Karen Bass displaying this home that, say, outside of Palisade area, would be a wonderful notion occurring and people believing that was happening and transpiring, but that was simply not the case. So a lot of these people have been displaced to places like Marina Del Rey. Some have gone down to Orange County, simply to have a home in order to rebuild. They want to rebuild on these properties, but they're just up against a number of conditions, which I can dig a bit deeper and get more detail with regard to this if you're curious about it. But
Yeah,
I
I'm
appreciated
certainly
you
interested
mentioning.
in general about kind of like the future of Los Angeles. My view, for what it's worth, is I think that there's so much pollution in since the fire in the ground in a lot of these places that we're really never ever going to really rebuild a lot of these properties. And I also have to say I'm somewhat in favor of the critique that a lot of these properties should probably be made into multifamily housing or should be made into kind of like the properties that we see elsewhere, like in the San Gabriel Valley, that allow for more people, more densely populated areas. I think it's kind of incredible that we've had like single family houses as long as we've had in these like very desirable areas. I should also say too, I looked at buying a property, multifamily home, actually, interestingly enough, in the Palisades, and I was out there about to make an offer on the place. I think I maybe even did make an offer on it, but it literally burned down in the fire. And so it was kind of interesting watching this area that I had known, that I'd loved, that I really spent a big chunk of my life in and around the Palisades, burned to the ground. I think we won't really ever know why the fires took place in a serious way. I do think it's interesting that this guy, Jonathan Rinderknecht, Knecht is his name. I've been doing a little research on him, and he's from this like extremely Christian family, and I think we're seeing a kind of similar thing to what we saw with Tyler Robinson, where we have these families that are kind of cult-like. Tyler Robinson's case, it's the Mormons. In Rinderknecht's place, it's these like extreme Christians, and his family were missionaries supposedly over in France. And what ends up happening is they kind of break from their family. And Jonathan, Rinderknecht was, in his late 20s, seemingly smoking weed all the time, had kind of paranoid delusions. And there's a certain sense in which he was kind of like turned into a kind of desperate Uber driver type. I think his critique of what was going on in California, this idea that you can build gated communities, keep everybody out. I think he's kind of right about that. His art is particularly kind of stirring, where he's showing this art he did with ChatGPT. Um, it's pretty wild what was going on there, and I don't think we're fully going to get the sense of what was really going on in his head. But I do think that there was a desire on his part as a kind of pyromaniac to burn down LA. And I think it's going to be something we're going to unfortunately, see more of in the future, as the world gets much more chaotic, and as the world gets much more, basically as the world gets drier as a result of climate change in the western part of the country. And it's certainly something I've been thinking a lot about. I have a lot of family, as many of you know, in California. I've spent a lot of time there myself. And so it's certainly something that I've been keeping an eye on. I don't know that you could ever really detect fires fast enough to kind of stop them, in any meaningful kind of way. It's a very difficult kind of question.
Are you suggesting there's going to be copycats, people who are inspired by his actions and might take it to their own, like, perceived, like, bourgeois yuppie areas and set them alight?
Well, if you think about it just logically, you have tremendous surface area in the western part of the country where fires can grow, and the ability to monitor and detect and stop fires. I have backed drone companies, and I've tried to invest in some technologies that could prevent this kind of thing, but it seems extremely unlikely that you'd be able to catch all of it. And yet, I think if you look at like the pictures there up in the jumbotron from from the acting U.S. attorney, you look at these photos, and this is somebody who clearly had a kind of ideological view, that he had a kind of uh, a kind of view that that life is kind of terrible in LA when you're young and broke and poor, and that there's a huge kind of income inequality, if you want to use the progressive terms. However you want to talk about it, there's a kind of uh, disconnect between the haves and have-nots in LA, that is really kind of jarring for people who've lived elsewhere in the country. It's certainly a place where you can fall very very far, and of course you have to wonder in a lot of these cases, where are the parents in these things? Where are the family members in these kind of things? I mean, his parents had all this time and energy to go to France to be missionaries all around the world. What Charles Dickens called telescope philanthropy. Well, where were his parents? When it came to kind of dealing with him. I mean, he's talking about being broke, potentially being homeless, living in L.A. Where was his family to support him? And ultimately, he moved back. We know that he has family in Melbourne, Florida, and that he was living, probably with them. It's kind of unclear, but it looks likely that he was living with his family members. And yeah, I don't think we will ever see Los Angeles or California really recover in any meaningful sense of the term. And I think we're going to have to deal with this question of like, what do we do when huge parts of our country are rendered harder to live in by climate change, by potential copycats. And my big fear is, in much the same way that the serial killer was replaced by the school shooter as kind of an object of public attention or public worry, my big fear is that the arsonist will ultimately replace the school shooter. And if you think about it just from a strategic standpoint, it's probably one of the greatest returns on sort of like chaotic investment, causing these massive fires. And it's certainly something that's hard to prove who actually did it in a lot of cases. I mean, we have an arrest made in this particular case. Apparently, he was brought in January, but we have an arrest made in October. 10 or so months after the fires were set. So it's
Well,
it's
Charles,
very
Charles, we
disturbing.
did
Yeah.
have a number of arsonists that were arrested closer to me. We had fires out near, say, where the Kardashians and that kind of clan lived. Now, these people had private fire crews, so there was no homes that were lost in those particular fires, and there were arsonists arrested at that point. But I do also agree with you that the property along Palisades, I don't think it's ever going to be able to return to habitable um, places to live until they really restore that area. But we did have a number of folks arrested. They did get those fires out. No houses perished at the time, thank goodness. But to your point, there's a lot of things here that really need to be delved into. It's a
Yeah,
pleasure
and
to
I
speak to
think
you on the
and I
space,
think by the
Charles.
way, one of the things that I saw, I reported this at the time, but there were lots and lots of like Chinese illegal drones and drones flying over the Palisades. I took some videos of it. I put it out at the time, and I think when you start having one fire, there's obviously the ability to have cover and do other fires, cause other fires to be burned as well. And so I don't think it's just this young man who is ultimately responsible for it, though I think he will be kind of a scapegoat in a way of what's going on. I think there are other fires that were triggered. And, I mentioned this before that I'd talked with Willie Brown, who is a sort of advisor to Kamala Harris and also to Karen Bass. And, this thing of them waiting, the fires waited until Karen Bass was in Africa. There's sort of all these kind of questions here about the future of LA. are there going to be more? Is there going to be more housing built? What's it going to look like going into the Olympics? And so, yeah, I think just in general, my critique of the situation is we're going to see over time a lot more chaos in Los Angeles and in California generally. And I don't know what to do about that, but I think it's going to be something it's going to become a very common thing, unfortunately.
You said you are looking at investing in drone technology to deal with forest fires for both first response and I don't know prevention. Is this event actually changing policy right now for the U.S. domestically? If this ability for drones to cover like the vast expenses of like West Coast forests and other parts of the U.S., why isn't there already a
I think there is. I don't. There's a company that I backed called Census Technologies, which is based out of Florida, and they've done very well for themselves dealing with like flood issues or hurricanes. I believe they do a lot of stuff in California as well. But yeah, my understanding is there is a lot more drone technology being used around forest fires, not just in this country, but in Europe as well. And so I'm probably not the most well versed to kind of talk about that, but it's certainly something that I think is changing, has changed. I just think there's going to be installation. I remember reading this installation of a lot of like basically like thermo cameras to like look for like potential hotspot breakout areas. But even still, I think you're going to have this issue where if you have a dedicated crew of people interested in like setting an area ablaze, they're going to be pretty effective at actually doing that. They can just kind of overwhelm emergency services, and I think we saw an aspect of that going into last January, where the systems were basically overwhelmed, and it's going to be interesting to watch as it shakes out. My sense of it, for what it's worth, is that there's a concerted effort to do population transfer within the United States to move lots of people from California, to the Great Lakes states, to move them to Texas and Florida. And I think we're going to see kind of more of that as time goes on. And I'm not sure yet what's going to happen in Houston, or excuse me, in Phoenix. But I think Phoenix is going to be another area where we're going to start seeing a lot more social unrest just because of the water issues.
so the push is to drive the it's a reverse American manifest destiny in a way where it's taking people from the West Coast on and bringing them back east.
That's right. I think, Mr. Producer, if you could find, there was an LA Times article recently about how they're not building new apartment buildings in California. Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the insurance, the cost of living, the basic issues of like providing for yourself in California becomes too expensive for people to actually live there. And you see lots of people moving from California, to Colorado, to Arizona, to Texas and Florida. And so, yeah, I think there's a concerted effort to move people out of California.
Is it just the how would you say overpopulation, or is it a larger percentage?
I think it's a combination of both overpopulation, which California has a huge illegal immigrant population, so nobody I think really knows the populations in California generally. And then there's the sort of just general issues of like what will people do for work? Commercial real estate is really low now, and in general, California has a pretty dynamic economy, but it's very boom and bust. And I think that there's lots and lots of problems in California, particularly if you live off the coast. A lot of social problems. The schools aren't very good. The housing costs are insane. The electricity is some of the highest in the nation. Pretty much the only thing that's kind of cheap, relatively speaking, is food prices. So yeah, I think you're going to start. Go ahead.
What are your thoughts about one family owning quite a significant amount of the water rights in
Yeah,
Southern
they're a
California?
pro Chabad family, the Resnicks. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, they do a lot in almonds and
The
pomegranates and whatnot.
the wonderful company, the
Yeah, the
pistachios,
wonderful
all the
company. Yep.
yeah,
correct.
they have a monopoly on pomegranate juice and pistachios.
Yeah, I mean they're an extremely strange bunch, and they fund a lot of weird activities in California politics and elsewhere. I think in general, California is just a very ungovernable place, and unfortunately, I don't think its leadership is going to get any better anytime soon. With Katie Porter, I think likely to be the next governor there, unfortunately. So yeah, I think it has real problems as a state. And I think we're going to see a lot more problems as time goes on. I've studied a little bit about this Resnick family. My understanding is that there's all these efforts to curtail them owning all the water rights, and that's kind of been like there's been all these court battles around it. Is my impression of it, and that none of them have really gone all that well for them. And I believe the family is quite. I believe the family is quite advanced in years. I think they're like in their 70s or 80s or something like that. But
Their
yeah,
labor forces largely concentrated their own, self-made favela. If there were to be an ice raid at their, labor facility, that would effectively be the end of their agricultural empire.
well, this is my big argument about how I know the Trump people aren't serious. Is that I've been to the slums basically that Mike Miller, Steve Miller's father, owns in West Covina. And I've seen a lot of these properties over the years that a lot of the Trump supporting people, a lot of Trump supporting Jews in Los Angeles County own. And there's obviously lots of illegal labor that they're kind of addicted to in different ways. And so, yeah, I think it's a real going concern. And yeah, I think basically there's not really an effort to crack down on a lot of this activity in California. And so you have to ask yourself why that is. Is Steve Miller using these illegal immigrants issues as a way of cracking down on certain political objectives that they have and ignoring certain other places where they own property? Yeah, so this piece that around Los Angeles apartment construction has dropped by close to a third in 3 years as developers struggle with unprofitable economics and regulatory uncertainty. It's kind of interesting watching what's going on there. But I think in general, yeah, I think the days in which people moved to California, well, I think we see this in the arsonist himself, right? He moved to California and then ultimately moved to Florida. I think a lot of the craziest people in the country are going to end up in Florida in one form or another, whereas they used to go west. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's a thing that we need to pay attention to. Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Tiger.
I was just going to lastly say, if you check out a place like Santa Monica, it's devolved extremely from where it once was. So your point is accurate.
Yeah, I just look at there's sewage issues in San Diego for Mexico. There's like a lot of things are happening in California where the quality of life in California is nowhere near what it was, and the price tag of it keeps getting higher and higher. So it's certainly something I noticed when I go and visit. I'm in California basically every other month or so, and the quality of life there has gotten really bad. Though there are parts of it that are improving, I should say. Like I think that there's efforts to clean up downtown that aren't necessarily bad, and we'll see what ends up happening with the. We'll see what ends up happening with. We'll see what ends up happening with the Olympics, which I think could be something that forever changes the kind of trajectory of LA, and that's going to be something I'm going to spend a lot more time focused on in the near term, thinking about the future of California and LA in particular. So.
So the last major fire to affect LA was over 100 years ago, and now it's suffered a new one. Are you anticipating a neo Los Angeles in the near future?
I could imagine a Los Angeles that was like highly densely populated.
Are we talking Blade Runner esque?
Not quite Blade Runner, although it would be awesome if it were. But I could imagine different Los Angeleses where the center of the city moves away from the coast or from the fire-prone areas into the downtown, and the downtown is revamped. I think you're going to see a lot more money go into cleaning up downtown LA. This. I don't know if you are familiar with the comedian Bill Burr, um, but
Unfortunately.
yeah. So I saw him when I was last in Los Angeles, and he was at the restaurant I was at in downtown. When I go to LA, I typically stay downtown, mostly because it's kind of like fascinating, kind of hellscape kind of area, and it's kind of like Koreatown. All those areas are kind of fascinating to me because there's as many as people know who've been to LA. There's sort of many LAs, kind of all jumbled together, and the sort of the whole of LA County, and to some extent Orange County, and the Inland Empire. It's sort of just like a giant suburb slash city, and it's kind of fascinating to see what's happened over the years, where all the people have come from all over the world. And my read on the future of California and future of LA is that fixing LA and making LA governable is going to take an awful lot of work. And I don't see either the Karen Basses of the world or the whoever that real estate developer guy was, if his name escapes me right now. I don't see either one of them being up to the task. So quite a problem. I don't know if there's anyone else wants to say anything. I think just generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with the progress I'm making in my book. Pretty happy with my day job. I've been enjoying watching people like Matt Gaetz and others take positions that I encouraged them to take like 3 or 5 years ago with respect to Netanyahu. All of that I think is very good. People are moving in the right direction on the Israel question. The one thing I would say is I am a little concerned that people are going to let up the pressure on a lot of the Israel folks, basically controlling big parts of our discourse. That makes me nervous, and so I think that'll be an interesting development to kind of to parse and to see where that goes. My sense is that the shutdown will probably continue for at least another week. If it doesn't get resolved in sort of the desire to fix everything all at once, my sense is that there's always this question of Chuck Schumer, Matt Iglesias. There's sort of a number of these kind of left-wing Jews, Ezra Klein, who I've kind of called them left-wing Likud in the past. And there's always this question of like, how much do they cause trouble in the United States as a way of placating, the Netanyahu government in different ways? I don't know. I mean, I sort of have to sort of think that through a bit more. But yeah, I think we're going to see, Gaza is going to be rebuilt. It's going to be rebuilt with lots of cash. My sense is that, it will be the Turks that are the security there. We're sort of watching the return of a kind of Turkish empire in the region, backed by Arab cash. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because there's lots of ways in which Turkey can help us in the region. But yeah, that's kind of where I am right now. I don't know if there's any other kind of big thoughts to be had. I know we've been going for about an hour and change. Mr. Producer, you want to message me? Is there have any super chats come in? Any other things I should know about? So yeah, I guess we're good for the moment, unless anyone else has anything they want to add. I see there's a few friends in here that I see are new friends, some old friends too. But yeah, we'll be doing this again. I think we'll do it on Wednesday. If not Wednesday, then Thursday. And I hope everybody has a very pleasant rest of your week. And thanks for everyone who joined in, and we'll catch up later. Take care.